on the Ocean Panel website. That's oceanpanel.org. Please see the link in the chat box. There are also QR codes in this presentation that will take you directly to the report. Secondly, we hope to have time to respond to questions from you in the audience. So you're encouraged to post your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Please indicate which panelist you would like to respond if you have a preference, and be sure to write what you have as a form of a question as opposed to a statement. And thirdly, today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a message within the next weeks with details on how to access the recording. So to provide some context to those less familiar with the Ocean Panel, it was established in September 2018 and is now composed of 18 serving world leaders, co-chaired by the Prime Minister of Norway and the President of Palau, with support from the UN Secretary General Special Envoy for the Ocean. As you can see from the map, the Ocean Panel is unique, comprising members from across the world, nations large and small, across all ocean basins at every stage of economic development and at extremes of the ocean environment, from the tropics to the Arctic. The Ocean Panel aims to facilitate a better, more resilient future for people and our planet. The goal is to deliver sustainable ocean economy where effective protection, sustainable production, and equitable prosperity go hand in hand. The means to do this is through 100% sustainable ocean management of national waters, guided by sustainable ocean plans. A key foundation of the Ocean Panel is to focus on best available science and knowledge to inform decision-making. And to this end, Ocean Panel members have commissioned a series of reports and papers on a diversity of topics relevant to achieving sustainable ocean economy. These have been produced through engagement with over 400 scientists, policy experts, and indigenous leaders from over 60 countries, and with a focus on diversity of authorship. The process is overseen and contributed to by the Ocean Panel Secretariat and the 3 lead experts. The key findings and recommendations of past Ocean Panel papers and reports have been condensed into an action-oriented document called the Transformations Agenda, and the blue paper we're exploring today was commissioned to help achieve an ambition that by 2030, ambitious climate action has set the world on track to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and restore ocean health. And so with that in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce members of the Blue Paper author team to dive into its contents further. Today, we have Professor Christopher Pierce, who is the Principal Marine Geoscientist at the National Oceanography Center in the UK. Professor Will Burns, co-director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University in America. And Professor David Ho, professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, USA. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Chris.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Caroline, and it's a pleasure to join you today. So I've got the inevitable task of introducing marine CDR, or marine carbon dioxide removal, and sort of highlighting some of the state of knowledge and understanding regarding the different approaches. Of course, I'm only going to scratch the surface, can't go into detail on all the techniques, so I do encourage you to look at the paper where we do delve into this in more detail. The starting point is always to emphasize that marine carbon dioxide removal and all forms of CDR are only going to support our goals of meeting climate mitigation targets, and they have to be conducted alongside rapid, urgent and deep emissions reduction schemes, as shown by the big purple box in this figure on the left-hand side. So although CDR can only accomplish the sort of removal of the residual emissions, which are the critically hard to abate sectors, they are essential in helping to meet those targets. And this figure also highlights the importance of the oceans in that context, in that they already play a highly significant role in supporting the removal of carbon dioxide in part of the natural cycles. So if you just advance the slide, you can see that role highlighted here in the links on the crosses on the left-hand side. So we move on to the next slide. Jump forward again. And we can start to see that the oceans is critical role in this process is because it is the largest exchangeable surface reservoir of carbon, indicated by the big circle on the right-hand side, looking at the dissolved inorganic carbon reservoirs. This significance of the oceans means we're already uptaking about a quarter of human emissions of CO2 into the oceans. And of course, this is driving impacts such as ocean acidification. So the oceans have this naturally significant role in facilitating the export of atmospheric CO2 into different reservoirs. And the question related to marine CDR is if or how or where we could accelerate those natural sinks. So the natural sinks, if we go on to the next slide, occur in three main forms. There's chemical processes that essentially buffer the atmospheric CO2 into more stable forms, such as bicarbonate, moving down that series of equations on the left-hand side. And this is a function of the natural absorbance of CO2 in the atmosphere into the oceans in certain areas. Biological approaches essentially look at the photosynthesis of marine microscopic plants and algae, seaweeds, which essentially convert the dissolved CO2 into the organic material and enabling the oceans to absorb more CO2. And of course, we can extract or sequester or remove or utilize that biological material in a form that removes that converted CO2 organic matter from that surface reservoir. And physical approaches are sort of a combination of the two, where they basically force or downwell the surface rich carbon waters and put them into the deep marine settings where they're no longer able to exchange with the overlying atmosphere. If we move on to the next slide, you can see some of the different marine CDR techniques that have been proposed to utilize those approaches. So on the left-hand side, you have the chemical approaches, such as direct ocean carbon capture and storage and ocean alkalinity enhancement that seek to ameliorate this natural chemical buffering capability of seawater, enabling the surface oceans to absorb more of the CO2. Biological approaches such as the cultivation and utilization of macroalgae or near coastal blue carbon ecosystem restoration that convert and store the CO2 into biomass, and also sort of techniques such as phytoplankton carbon solutions and fertilization that stimulate the growth of microscopic algae in open ocean settings. And of course, finally, there's the potential to use downwelling as a physical technique for forcing the CO2 enriched surface waters into deep marine settings. If we go on to the next slide, there are lots of questions with all of these approaches. This is just a snapshot of some of the considerations that are currently facing the community and implementers of these techniques. We don't seek to address all these questions in this report, but it's certainly an active area that the community at large are considering, and maybe something we can touch on later. So if we move on to the next slide, we can start to showcase what we did facilitate in this report, which is to highlight that the different techniques shown in the column on the left-hand side with the example methods and approaches, all of these have an array of considerations that are at various different states of readiness, or TRL, technology readiness level, or scientific understanding. And these different considerations are shown in the columns on the right-hand side, things like the scientific understanding and principles, the technological capability, the energy and material costs associated with it, the environmental impacts, monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, and of course, then what that means overall. This is just a snapshot. There are other considerations not captured in this image, but hopefully you can see from this summary that the overarching understanding of TRL of any given approach does not encapsulate an array of understanding for any different component. And as a result, we need to look more in depth at what is going to be considered for each setting. So we're going to sort of highlight just very briefly on sort of the environmental impacts and MRV consideration with these. So firstly, looking at the environmental impacts. In the next slide, when we look at marine chemical approaches. So if we move on one more. Yeah, we can still see we actually do have a relatively good understanding of the types of impacts that each approach might have, affecting the potential for water quality, the primary productivity, sediments and habitats, as well as ecosystem diversity. These types of effects are relatively well understood, but we don't know the extent to which they might be impacted at different scales and how those techniques will vary for each different approach. And the same applies to biological approaches, which are summarized in the next slide as well. So improving our understanding of these potential environmental impacts really requires us to start doing very small scale controlled experiments under tightly constrained conditions, in which we can start to see what these effects might be in real world settings when we start to use these types of mediations. If we move on to the next slide, we can look at the sort of the types of considerations associated with MRV. This is often highlighted within the sector, certainly for markets and regulators, how we understand whether a technique is doing what it sets out to do. Now, this is a key consideration and challenge for both the chemical and biological approaches, and summarised a couple of the quotes contained within the report here. And the challenges often relate to the fact that the oceans are a mobile entity. What you put into the water at one place will very quickly be transported to a different setting. And the same goes for the actual absorption of CO2 from the atmosphere into the seawater, as this is a process that can take weeks or months. And so we need to consider that when we're looking at where we're going to be monitoring the uptake of the oceans. As a result, we already know that the oceans will need to, MOV will need to integrate measurements and models, and facilitating that is a key direction of our research at present. So that brings us on to the final slide of this section, looking at the priorities for improving our knowledge. As mentioned, we do need to conduct a suite of small-scale and controlled field trials to improve our knowledge of what these in situ effects might be. And in doing so, we will improve our understanding of how to monitor, report, and verify those effects, in addition to their environmental impacts, which would be important for regulatory concerns. Briefly within this section, we also touched on the fact that viable financing mechanisms are needed. Thus far, all this has been pilot studies are primarily driven by the commercial entities and the voluntary carbon market. Thus, driving us to further compliance market is essential. And finally, of course, just because an approach might be scientifically viable, we need to recognise that it may not have that social or governance considerations that enable it to proceed at climatically relevant scales. And that's an appropriate setting for me to stop off and us to move on to the next section.
Will, you're on mute.
In the second section of the report, we focused on governance and regulatory issues with an emphasis on the role of international regimes. And one of the things that we emphasized at the outset is that there is no dedicated regulatory regime or section of a regime for marine carbon removal at this point. And so as a consequence, we've had a couple of regimes that have intervened because they've deemed that that the potential impacts of marine carbon removal or the nature of the activities would fall within their remit. And then there's other regimes that we believe could intervene in the future. And so you can see a number of them here that we cited. The London Convention and Protocol is at the center because it has been the most kinetic in this context, and we'll talk a bit more about London in a moment. But others that have been involved include the Convention on Biological Diversity, which passed a resolution in the last decade that essentially called for limiting "quote unquote" marine geoengineering activities to scientific research only, no commercial motivation, subject to risk assessment, which was essentially what the London Convention had also done during that decade. In the future, there's a number of other regimes that may be pertinent. The Law of the Sea Convention, obviously, including all of its provisions for regulating pollution, for which some of these approaches could be deemed to be such, but also the remit of the Law of the Sea Convention to protect the world's oceans from negative impacts, which, as the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea has indicated recently, includes climate change. And mCDR is obviously an approach that could be pertinent for that. The Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, which is an implementing agreement under the Law of the Sea Convention, which will come into force in January, has a number of provisions, including environmental impact assessment, area-based management tools, technology transfer that could be relevant to regulation of these approaches, as well as an overarching remit to coordinate between regimes on anything that could have impact on biodiversity in the open oceans. And of course, the climate regimes themselves, including the Paris agreements, preambular language that says that when we look at responses to climate change, we're also to look at potential impacts on things such as human rights, and the Article 6 market-based agreements, which may come into play in the future in terms of the trading of credits related to marine carbon removal. Next slide. As I indicated, the most active regime in the context of marine carbon removal has been the London Convention and the London Protocol, which was developed in the 90s. Both these regimes regulate the deposition of materials into the world's oceans. And as I said, in 2008, the parties to the convention passed a resolution, and that resolution said that marine ocean iron fertilization activities had to be limited to scientific research and risk assessment. An amendment was passed to the protocol in 2013 that establishes that framework and widens it a bit. It initially only regulates ocean iron fertilization, but contemplates that other marine carbon removal approaches could be added in the future. And then recently, they've established a correspondence group on marine geoengineering, as well as a legal group that have started looking at the possibility of adding a couple of other mCDR approaches under the rubric of the amendment to the London Protocol, including ocean alkalinity enhancement and biomass sinking. And then there's been the discussion if the amendment does not come into force soon under the protocol, which is likely to be true, the possibility of passing a resolution which calls upon the parties to essentially restrict these other activities to science-based interventions. And so that's an ongoing process. And in the upcoming meeting, these issues will be discussed again. And so this remains in flux and most likely will for a number of years as these various regimes contemplate what their role should be and how to coordinate their respective roles. Thank you.
Okay, so this third part is about what governments can do. And so the current state of affairs is that there have been various codes of conduct that have been published that say CDR should be a public good. And mCDR is, of course, included in that. So what that requires is transparency, public participation, consideration of environmental justice, and international cooperation. And the other thing is that CDR has to go from something that most people have never heard of to the largest thing humanity has ever done in a relatively short time. And that takes a lot of work. And the people that do know about CDR, they generally prefer, something that sounds more natural to engineer solutions. But we know that the engineer solutions are the ones that are more durable and so more effective and can scale. So a lot of communications is needed on that front. Next. So mCDR research will need a lot of money, right, on various aspects, not just the technical aspect, but also geophysical, environmental, social, financial, regulatory. And some people already think too much money is going into CDR and we should spend it on decarbonization instead. But the reality is that investment in CDR, right now it's something like $190 million a year, is dwarfed by investment in renewables, which is about 2.1 trillion every year. So that's over 1,000,000% more going into decarbonization, right? And then the deployment of CDR will also cost, probably $1 trillion, right? If we're talking about, this goal, this mythical goal of $100 a ton, and we want to do 10 gigatons a year, that's $1 trillion right there. And a lot of these methods, it's possible that we can't get them under $100 a ton, right? So who's going to spend $1 trillion a year on something that has no direct benefits, right? For comparison, worldwide philanthropy giving right now, it's 700 to $800 billion a year, right? So that's much less than $1 trillion, right? And then if we stick to the approach that we're taking where governments aren't involved, then you have these risks that environmental safety is neglected, as we see with a lot of commercial activities. And deployment will only be based on profit. And the intellectual property barriers will exclude the Global South from participating. And there are already examples of how CDR is co-opted by fossil fuel companies for greenwashing and for continuing to extract fossil fuels, right? Next. So what does government participation look like? Can I have the next slide? So what we envision are in mCDR in particular is pre-permitted test sites where there's adequate infrastructure and monitoring so that different techniques can be tried and examined. And the funding model is that all the research money comes from governments on various aspects of mCDR, not just the technology, right, but also the environmental safety, the social aspect, and so on. And you can think of it as like the national lab networks that we have in the US or even the Manhattan Project during World War II. And then the last thing is that there should be government-led public engagement to get community input that shapes the development of mCDR, much like what the UK has done quite successfully with wind energy deployment, both onshore and offshore. Okay, thanks.
Thank you to our speakers. Very efficient to cover a complicated topic, so much appreciated. And I think we can get into it even deeper with a panel discussion. So I'm happy to introduce. Moderating today's discussion is Professor Scott Doney. Scott is the Joe D. and Helen J. Kington Professor in Environmental Change at the University of Virginia in the USA. Scott was also a co-lead coordinating author of the Blue Paper. And alongside Chris, Will, and David, we have joining us another member of the author team, Dr. Natalia Gallo, who is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Research Institute in Norway. Take it away, Scott.
Oh, great. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks to Will and Dave and Chris. Those were excellent presentations. I wanted to start with Chris. You sort of were talking about some of the complications of the amount of knowledge we need, and folks, it was emphasized about research of codes of conduct. One of the things we've seen in the last few years is the emergence of field trials for some of these techniques. So maybe Chris, and then open it up to other panelists. Where are we with field trials? What are the challenges? What are some of the opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think it's been a challenge to run field trials, primarily due to funding, but also, as Will mentioned, kind of due to the regulatory and governance aspects of this. Essentially, for regulators to give permits for field trials to proceed, they need to have sufficient scientific knowledge, which requires evidence, which in itself requires a field trial to have been conducted under that scenario. So we are presently caught in a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, but that hasn't stopped some activities proceeding under these sort of very carefully constrained, very community engaged projects. There are some excellent examples of that. We've recently seen one completed by Woods Hole. Adam Sobus led the Loch Ness program, which is funded by the US. And we've also seen commercial led field trials. Another example being Planetary field trial in Tosco in Halifax. So there are other companies doing other types of trials, both in chemical approaches, and some companies starting to look to do this in sort of using some of the biological approaches as well. So we at present do not have many in situ examples of this work being conducted at these sorts of scales. but we do have small test beds. We have small examples from mesocosm experiments, both led by research programs and other entities, that are starting to give us the knowledge required to expand, extrapolate. But again, further work is required for this. A database is available on current field trials through Ocean Vision's website. I'm sure that other field trials will be happening in the future, hopefully, though. So do keep posted on that.
Dave or Will or Natalia, any thoughts on field trials?
I think we're definitely going to learn things from the field trials that may streamline this process. I think the regulators will become more comfortable if some of these field trials that are initially done are done in a really responsible way and are transparent. And Loch Ness is a great example. Ebb Carbon also obtained
The Loch Ness is the Woods Hole one, right? That Chris
the Woods
mentioned.
Hole one. Yeah. And then Ebb Carbon has just launched the Project Macoma at Port Angeles in Washington under the Clean Water Act. And so we're starting to learn how to utilize at the national level some of the regulatory mechanisms that may be necessary to facilitate this kind of experimentation.
Yeah, and like I said in my presentation, I think if we had pre-permitted sites where field trials could be conducted, that would make things a lot easier. And also people would trust it more because there would be adequate monitoring and the dissemination of information.
Yeah, I would just add there to David's point, and also to bring in a question brought up by Peter Edwards about coordination between mCDR and the fisheries community, that having these kind of test bed field sites, the process of establishing where those are, I think, would provide a good interface for having these conversations with other types of marine use communities to make sure that we are building trust and having an open and transparent discussion with these other users of the marine space.
And I guess that sort of falls on to the next, what are the pitfalls? People have done work saying that these might be able to scale up and take down carbon, but what are some of the potential downsides for the environment, for communities? What should we be paying attention to?
You
want to start, Chris?
Yeah. I didn't know that Natalia does not work in this area as well. Yeah, I think there are going to be impacts. I think we can't shy away from that. That when you start to influence or perturb an environment, something will be changing, and that's a natural consequence. But we also need to consider the counter aspect of taking inaction, which is that the environment's changing already. We see that. We know that ocean acidification is the example of atmospheric CO2 levels increasing and absorbing into the ocean. But it's not just that. We're seeing increased runoff, increased nutrient export, eutrophication, seeing sedimentation. All human impacts on activities are influencing the marine environment. So when we want to start to consider what those environmental impacts would be of these perturbations, we need to look at both the scale of the activity, and the approach. Of course, the setting is going to be very location and marine CDR approach dependent. We also need to consider, the sensitivities of downstream, so the wider footprint of this. What is the discharge nature and direction of travel of those currents? What other communities still sit within those environments that may have knock-on effects beyond where we're immediately looking? But also the scale and the nature of the feedstock being used, or the type of approach being applied. If you're looking at chemical approaches where you're meliating seawater, then what are you adding? Will that sink? Will it rapidly disperse? Are you changing the seawater in ways that may impact or not impact communities to the best of our understanding? And this is why we need to start the small scale and gradually work our way up through a series of stage gate approaches that kind of give us, as a scientific academic community, but also give the regulators, the public, other sectors, and marine industries confidence that what is happening is not detrimental to their health, but can in some senses be potentially beneficial by supporting the growth of other organisms and ecosystems.
Yeah, if I could just add to Chris's points there. I mean, really, we need to give the scientific community and the public confidence that we understand the likelihood and severity of harm of the different methods. We also need to communicate that as much as we would like to portray the ocean as a very well understood and very well monitored system, we have very large gaps in our baseline ocean carbon monitoring. We have very large knowledge gaps in our understanding of deep sea processes. And of course, the majority of the carbon that we are wanting to store in the ocean will be stored in the deep sea. So being upfront about where the knowledge gaps exist and making sure that we can have a clear view on the known potential impacts of these methods, but also have specific protocols that allow us to change our actions if we see certain tipping points that are potentially unexpected impacts as well.
Will, did you have anything you wanted to, Will or Dave?
I think the only thing I'd add is to emphasize what Chris was saying, but it's a controversial proposition, which is this idea of comparative risk assessment, right? Any of these approaches, by definition, will have impacts. The question is, do we weigh those against the potentially catastrophic impacts of not acting? But of course, in these early stages, we're not able to really quantify benefits and risks adequately to be able to proceed in that way. But down the road, we may have to. And one of the issues we have is that a lot of these regimes we have to regulate these approaches are pollution regimes, right? And they use language like only allow things to be introduced that are introduced in small quantities, right? And it's not really fit for purpose for these kind of interventions, because we never contemplated that these kind of interventions and putting things in the water may be beneficial in some cases, right? And so how do we, as a society, acknowledge that, but also do it in a responsible way and assume that if there are impacts, they're not disproportionately meted out to the most vulnerable groups, right? And that's always a challenge.
Dave, I want to come back to maybe Dave, you and Chris. You know, Chris mentioned, you know, water in the ocean moves, it's mobile, it stirs, it mixes. Dave, you've talked in other venues about the challenges of looking at the exchange of carbon dioxide gas between the atmosphere and the ocean. How hard is it to actually account? You know, if someone goes out and does a field trial or eventually a deployment, how hard is it going to be to track this carbon, to actually know that we're doing what we think we are? We're actually removing carbon from the atmosphere.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard thing for a number of reasons. Chris mentions the temporal spatial scale, but there's also the fact that the ocean already takes up a lot of carbon now, right? So it takes up something like 10 billion tons of CO2 every year. And whatever field trial is conducted will be a tiny little signal on top of this huge noise. And so the only way to get the counterfactual is by modeling, because you can't measure a counterfactual. And so we have to develop models that are trustworthy. And in order for models to get there, you need a lot of data. So I think we have a long ways to go before we can say definitively, like, this deployment removed this amount of carbon.
Chris or Natalia, anything you wanted to add on that?
I fully agree with David. I think we absolutely have to look at this integration of models. I would say that we do have the technical capabilities to do those in situ measurements, so we can monitor things. It's just not cost effective or practical to actually do that over the depth and breadth of the sort of trials and scales that we're considering. So whilst it can be done, what we've got to find is a comfortable trade-off between these in situ measurements and what we're actually, the chemical perturbations we're measuring and the fluxes we're watching into the oceans, with that broader scale, climatically relevant scale of CO2 changes. And that requires this integration between models and measurements, which are then acceptable to both the carbon markets, if this is being done for commercial profit, but also to the regulators and to the kind of wider society. So it's that trade-off and this question of uncertainties of what we're happy to see is what I think is critical, and that requires a sort of collective effort to use field trials and kind of work out what's going to be comfortable. And the other side of that, of course, is the data. Where's that data going to sit? Who's going to look at that? How are we going to deal with this masses of information being collected and pulled together? And where does that sit? So that's kind of a separate aspect.
Well, can you just follow up, and maybe others? What is the data? Sometimes transparency gets tossed around. Where does that come in? What are the issues you see between sort of government funded research and private industry funded research?
Well, from my perspective, and I'm happy for others to chip in, I think we're dealing with an emerging sector right now. I think we have to recognize that at this point in time, to get confidence in any technique, whether it's a commercial entity or academic field trial, we have to see transparency and access to that data to enable scrutinization. And I am happy that from my perspective, I do see that is happening. Certainly commercial activities and research activities are seeking to get that data out there. Of course, where that ends up is something we need to be cognizant of. There are also established mechanisms for pooling global carbon observations. There's networks, ICOS and GOOS and other platforms that have that target in mind. So we need to sort of ensure that where we start to look at carbon system in its potential to be manipulated, that we utilize and draw on that expertise. And that unfortunately will require significantly more effort and investment, I feel, because it's a challenge, and it has been a challenge for many decades now for the oceanographic community. So it's something we need to focus on moving forwards.
Yeah, if I could just add as well to that, I mean, with the UN Ocean Decade, the ocean observing community is really starting to look at what are good, robust, long-term ways of being able to store and share data and make sure that it's interoperable for different uses. And so through the Otis efforts, I believe that they're starting with looking at national ocean data centers as the main locations of data repositories in order to get kind of all of the metadata appropriately standardized so that they can create these pipelines so ocean data becomes very interoperable, allowing us to have a very robust ocean observing program. And I mean, ideally, I think you would have the protocols where anyone who's doing mCDR field trials would basically be using the same best practices and having the same data protocols, so they're submitting those data to their national ocean data centers so that they're part of that pipeline feeding into this global ocean carbon observing system.
So can I add something to that? So for government-funded research, there's a mandate to archive the data and make it publicly available. And that's not necessarily the case for other kinds of research, but there's a group, the Carbon to Sea Initiative, who funds a lot of work on ocean alkalinity enhancement, who does have a data protocol for how you're supposed to archive data and share data. So I think that is a good example of, the private side sort of trying to mimic what government funders require.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. We've seen a lot of stories in the news about failures of the voluntary carbon credit market on the terrestrial side, for forest protection and reforestation projects, for example. Where are we? Are companies already claiming carbon credits for marine CDR? Where are we in that space? Should we be even giving credits yet for marine CDR? Oh, Will, you look like you want to take that one.
Well, I mean, we may not all agree on this, right? But
that's great. Love discussion.
My take is no. I don't think that we should be issuing credits for any of these approaches yet, and yet we have. There's companies that are desperate to achieve their net zero goals that are perfectly willing to accept those credits, and probably governments ultimately down the road under Paris, for example. But I don't think we have adequate data in terms of MRV and to do that. At the same time, I'm extremely sympathetic to these companies who are almost all extremely small, burning through capital quickly, given the R&D requirements for these approaches and the regulatory mandates to have to monetize, right? I just think it's woeful that we aren't providing sufficient government funding, given the fact that this is going to be a common good, to allow those companies to proceed more slowly and methodically, and in a way that I think would facilitate more integrity in terms of these claims. But it's a difficult situation, and in the United States, it's gotten worse because we've cut now a lot of the funding and a lot of the federal governmental expertise for mCDR, and that's put more of an onus on these companies, and many of them who are in the tender mercies of venture capitalists who want them to move fast and break things, and that's a bad way to proceed. So I'm uneasy in terms of where we are.
Other folks?
I agree with Will.
Yeah, I do agree. I think to echo the point that we need to have the sympathy with the commercial entities who have been driving the sector forward and are being open to academic engagement and transparency at this time. I think there isn't that their income streams are finite. They have a chance to deliver, but not at all costs. And I think that's a challenge that they have, is they are depending on credit income, but that should not result to them doing activities that are not supported by scientific knowledge. And I think that's where the risk sits, is that if we aren't providing sufficient means to enable those activities to proceed within the realms of scientific understanding and hand in hand with scientific knowledge gain, then there's a risk that they will overstep those boundaries. And there are examples of that happening. And I think we need to ensure that it doesn't happen in the future. And we need to work in tandem in cognizance of that, and ensure that science and science understanding remains at the forefront of any future implementation and credit sales. And I think there are protocols out there, and those protocols are accepting scrutiny, and it's up to us within academic and wider circles to contribute to that scrutiny in a constructive manner.
Natalia, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said by Chris and David here. I would just comment and say that I think in some cases, I feel like the academic community has been a bit slow in being willing to engage, and sometimes it feels like the industry sector and the sector that is developing the voluntary carbon markets and the methodologies for those has moved so fast that a lot of times I feel like my colleagues aren't aware that this is actually happening now and isn't just something that is kind of on discussion for 10 years in the future.
So Will and others, you guys have mentioned, we if we want to do this, we don't want to overly burden communities, coastal communities that often have already seen environmental injustices and inequities in the past. What are best practices? What should we be doing to engaging communities in advance and co-developing knowledge? And where are we in that?
I might start with David for that, because David's section really focused on that work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have enough time to get into what the UK did in terms of wind energy deployment.
UK in terms of what? Maybe everybody's not familiar with what you're. Can you just give a brief, what's the issue?
So there was early on, there was a lot of opposition to wind energy, a lot of NIMBY kind of things. But then like Chris actually is from the UK, and he can probably speak to this from personal experience. But we saw that as a good example of how you get people to yes, right? I mean, there's profit sharing, there's getting people to understand what this looks like for their views and like their literal views, like out of their backyards, and and then so this was for onshore wind, and then for offshore wind, people were more accepting of it because they don't see it directly, and then they're proud that the UK is, a leader in, technology, right, and innovation. I don't know, Chris, maybe you want to speak to what that looked like as a citizen.
Well, I think, yeah, I think we're stepping beyond the scope of this report and our experience, but I think it is good to have these good examples of utilization of marine environments in this context. And as someone who can go down the coastline quite easily and see that, yeah, it is something that should be seen as a win. But I think when it comes to how you translate the offshore renewable sector to the marine carbon dioxide removal sector, there is a difference insofar as we have been preconceived to view marine environments as inherently protected. Any addition is adding waste, is dumping, oceanification is bad. So any intentional perturbation of the marine environments is considered bad. Yeah, we are oblivious to unintended remediation of those environments. So there is kind of this double-edged sword to action versus inaction, whereas renewable is kind of action to offset something that's visible because we're reducing our emissions. So I think there is a nuance there, but we do need to certainly your point, David, I think, is that we need to draw on successful examples of where we have been able to establish sectors and translate that over to marine CDR technologies as guidance, and particularly for understanding where it doesn't work, because just because offshore renewables are in place in some places doesn't mean they've been installed everywhere. So I think there's lessons to be brought across.
I think we need far more robust sort of public engagement protocols, and those that are more focused on deliberation and on co-development of these kind of projects than we've had to date. The traditional approach is something that's usually known by the acronym of DEAD, which is decide, educate, announce, and defend. And that's what is often happened in these kinds of projects, right? Where the project developers have the permit in hand, and then they do the 2 hour dog and pony show where they go to the community and speak to the community and hear its needs. A lot of these approaches, these communities don't understand these technologies at all because it's abstruse, right? Even for those of us that are in the field, especially as non-scientists, right? And we need approaches that bring members of the community together for much longer periods than 2 hours, and to engage in real deliberation about the costs, the benefits, the trade-offs, the alternatives, and provide some ambassadors from the community with the kind of information where they can go back to the broader community and discuss those aspects and try to obtain real community feedback before these kind of projects proceed. We're starting to see some of that, and project developers, to their credit, I think are learning how to do this better. Loch Ness, which we mentioned before from Woods Hole's, perfect example. It really proceeded in many ways with this a paradigm at the outset, and then when it faced community resistance, especially from the fishers community, really, in my opinion, started to meaningfully engage, bring fishers into the process. There was a representative from the industry on the research boats themselves, right? Provide access to that information. That's a kind of approach that I think is likely to attain a lot more legitimacy in the long term.
Natalia, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I'm in agreement with what Willa said, and just wanted to reiterate that I think having social legitimacy of the rollout and implementation of this, both in terms of the research space and the industry space, is incredibly important, and making sure that we're talking to local communities and also bringing in local knowledge and indigenous communities in these discussions. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I think there's a lot of distrust surrounding this industry right now, and I think for good reason. So I think having these transparent conversations and engaging early and often is incredibly important.
So just Natalia, follow-up, you and others have highlighted sort of the human dimension of this. When people think about research and development, they often think about, ships and robots and satellites and models. What about the social sciences? How do the social sciences help us move forward in this problem?
Well, I'm not a social scientist. I'm an
I
ecologist and
know,
oceanographer, so I just don't want to present myself as a social scientist, but I would say that we absolutely need social scientists at the table, because they can really help us understand how people are perceiving an issue, why they respond in a certain way. They allow us to study theories of change in terms of why people behave in a certain way when presented with information or opportunities of this or that. They can help us study the history of different conflicts. They can, for example, I'm thinking about one of my colleagues who's looked at the similarities between how Pacific small island developing states have responded to deep sea mining interests and how that might inform us about how they might respond to mCDR. So I think there's a tremendous role for social scientists here in helping us as a research community make sure that we're covering the research space holistically in the development of mCDR.
And I should mention, there were social scientists involved in the development of this report, but we just don't have any on the panel. So I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I just want to make sure we highlight the importance of it. Will, do you have any thoughts on that regard?
Yeah, I'd agree with Natalia. There was an excellent paper recently that talked about the problems that a startup company called Planetary had off the coast of Cornwall with the ocean alkalinity enhancement experiment. And one of the things that the article argues was that there was a real failure to look at the historic legacy of pollution and extraction in that area and perceptions that the government really had not adequately monitored environmental impacts, and that fed into the narrative that this experiment was not going to proceed responsibly, or that it could add to that historic legacy. And that's something that we need to understand, acknowledge, and work with to help those communities.
Thanks. So we have a few minutes left. So just sort of wrapping up, we sort of started with this talking about, research and development and governance and the role that governments can play. Just give each of the panelists an opportunity. What if you had a magic wand, what's the sort of top priority you have for what government should be doing in this marine carbon dioxide removal space?
David, you go first.
I would say funding, like lots and lots of money.
Words out of one mouth as well. I completely agree. I think, we need science to stay ahead of decisions, and we need science to inform decisions, and that needs us to stay ahead of the implementation potential. That can only be done through independent funding mechanisms. I do think that we have to work hand in hand with commercial entities, but governments, they absolutely have to sort of support this if they want it to be part of the solution. And quite frankly, we know we need a portfolio of solutions. We know that oceans will be part of global climate mitigation, whether actively or passively. And myself and this report does not advocate for marine CDR implementation, but advocates for understanding what can be done, and it's that understanding that requires independent funding.
Will, do you have any thoughts more on the governance side?
Yes, as a token lawyer, I guess I'd say that we should look to this new regime, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, potentially as really helping us in several roles. One is, as I said before, this call for coordination between regimes, given the fact that we have a number of regimes that already have intervened on mCDR and others that weren't even on that list. I think regional fisheries management organizations will be interested if these things were to proceed at scale. Regional pollution regimes probably would be interested. And BBNJ may facilitate the coordination of those activities of those regimes and bring them together. The other thing that BBNJ has is a far more robust environmental impact assessment process, which includes a more precautionary approach that I think is pertinent when it comes to mCDR research and certainly deployment. And it has a good provision for strategic environmental assessment, which I think is going to be important to coordinate potentially a number of these approaches being used in the same area, and how we ensure that those are done in a way that's synergistic, and also coordinating with all of the other potential uses of the oceans in those areas. That kind of strategic focus on plans and programs as opposed to individual projects is going to be critical if ultimately we're going to integrate this in our response mechanisms to climate change.
Thanks, Will. And Natalia, give you the last word for the panel.
Yeah, I mean, I think governments have a big role to play in also fostering conversations, both conversations with the scientists in their countries that are doing this type of research and working on these types of reports. I mean, from the report, we see that basically, except for blue carbon, all of the other mCDR techniques we evaluated were only in the conceptual or experimental readiness level for environmental impact. So a lot of work still needs to be done. There is a lot of interest from industry, so we really need governments to play this role, kind of facilitating the knowledge development here in this space, and also making sure that within these cross-UN treaties, we have kind of consistent conversations about how we're considering impacts from mCDR and for climate mitigation across other types of agendas like biodiversity, protection of biodiversity, 30 by 30 goals, and making sure that governments are helping us interface and making sure we're regulating holistically.
The 30 by 30 is protecting, for example, 30% of the ocean by 2030, right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Great. Well, I want to thank the panel for a wonderful discussion and for the speakers who presented at the beginning. Stimulating discussion. I'd encourage everybody to take a look at the report. And this is a rapidly moving space, and so please keep your eye out, and hopefully the high-level ocean panel and other groups can keep this conduit of information coming between the scientific community, the social science, natural science, legal, academic community, and what's needed by governments to properly move this space forward. So thanks, everybody. Carolyn, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you have any final word.
Thanks so much, Scott. I did just want to note we had a lot of great questions in the Q&A, and it's hard to get to everything on such an interesting and complex topic. So we will type responses and share out anything that we didn't get to cover. And also thanks for all the great links that were shared. We'll share those out with the webinar recording as well. But thanks so much, all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much for organizing, and to the other speakers. It was really a great event.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Cheers.